everybody for joining into the presentation. I'm Larry Orman, and as Mickey said, and you might or might not have heard, I am with GreenInfo Network. I was one of the person who really helped found it about 20 years ago. What I want to go through is the way we think about geospatial technology, and maybe that's something that could be useful to everybody who's doing that on this call. Just a little bit of word about myself. I'm actually the deputy director of GreenInfo now. Dan Rademacher, who's the new executive director, is also on the call with me, and I'm doing a transition with him for most of this coming year to make sure we have a smooth handoff after 20 years of doing great work. And he'll be available if anyone has questions about all that. But I'm also pretty involved still. So the roadmap that I want to go through today is really these things. I want to just a few things about GreenInfo, but mostly focusing on how we approach basic GIS-based, geospatial, interactive-based, and then how we think about design and communication, because that's really pretty critical stuff for us. I'll recite that if anybody has questions or comments, by all means, put them into the chat window, and I'll try to answer those along the way. So about GreenInfo, we typically work for 80 to 100 different groups every year. They range from very small nonprofits to larger ones, typically groups with budgets under a couple $1 million. We don't usually do too much work for giant national organizations or even international ones. We've got an awful lot of experience in the conservation arena, but our work really covers a much broader array, and the dozen people who do the work here are really able to kind of follow this mission, which is trying to be of service to all these different public interest groups who may have a difficult time accessing geospatial technology. What we try to do with this is really not limit ourselves. We have a strong focus on conservation and environmental groups, but we're also very involved with a lot of groups who are working on social justice and all sorts of health and other issues, and we really basically think that if you're trying to bring geography and place into some conversation, it really doesn't matter what your topic is. We probably will be willing to help you and probably can. So I want to start with this arena first, which is kind of the traditional GIS mapping data analysis world, and characterize that we're using pretty similar tools. Most of the GIS work is Esri based. We do tend to work with QGIS for a number of things. If anybody has experience with it, that's the free open source GIS system that actually can be very useful. We characterize a lot of the use of this technology by having a pretty strong design sense, and I'll refer to that throughout all this. It really has distinguished us over these years. And we're very sort of, what do you need kind of based. I often talk about as being custom cabinet makers. We're not producing the next line for IKEA. We're building the thing that you need. And so that's really a strong focus for what we do. A lot of this is going to be images, and I'll talk from images, but this is a very strong basic approach that we bring to something. It's a land trust in the Napa Valley of the Bay Area here in San Francisco that has been around for a long time, and every year it updates this poster and has it given out to its donors and all this sort of stuff. But it's something that we've worked at over the years to get them a very clear presentation of what their holdings are, and that presentation involves not only the cartography but also the design of the frame, which in general is often a weakness in GIS work, that people focus on what's in the map itself, and don't think about how it presents to the user. And again, I'll say more about that later. Another example of a conservation group up in the Lake Tahoe area of California who simply wanted to talk to people about what they've accomplished. So this was a carefully designed piece to let them have that conversation over the years as they work in this focus area. We do an awful lot of work with demographic data, and these are two interesting projects. The one on the left is census data for the city of San Francisco, but it's done in a very particular way. Rather than use even the small grain of census blocks, and certainly not tracts or block groups, we've taken data on the building footprints throughout San Francisco, and we cookie cuttered the census to basically have the census data speak through the buildings, the residential buildings that people live in. We then knocked out areas that had commercial domination of commercial or open space areas. And what you get is a picture of San Francisco that's very granular. It's very much what the nature of the city is, even though we're using census block group, or this is probably actually block data directly. So it's kind of a neat way of getting past the limitations of census data, which often mischaracterize large areas where people aren't. This other map on the bottom right is a series of 40 or 50 maps that were done to show where different kinds of languages were spoken. As I said, design is really a big issue for us. So there's not a small amount of GIS that looks like this image. And our argument is, well, you can use ARC if you're just smart about using it to do this. There's no reason you can't make really coherent, visually effective maps using ARC tools. Everything you're going to see here is all ARC based. There's no Illustrator, there's no nothing. We do it all in ARC. So we try to really focus on that clarity because we realize that no matter how good your data is, at the end of the day, if it doesn't communicate something, you're really not helping your client out very much. This is just to underscore that cartography for us really is, there's no conventions. We're focused on what the message is, and in this case, it was an affordable housing program that wanted to highlight where parcels that scored highly were. So we just got rid of as much else as we could, including, for example, north arrows. We never use north arrows because north is on the top of all maps. If it isn't, we'll use one. And conventions like this can just get in the way of a real message. So we're very messages first. Official cartography rules are way, way down the list. These are just some other examples of things where we've done technical maps, we've done broad illustration maps that show a watershed. This is the same watershed, just looking at it differently. This was an interesting project where sea level rise is a big issue here in the coastal areas. And in the San Francisco Bay, this is the area actually of Silicon Valley, from the upper left of that map down to San Jose on the right is really where all these tech companies are. And it turns out a lot of them are in the path of likely sea level rise over the next 40, 50 years. So we did a map and we said, well, let's put the logos on it. It's not very pretty, but it gets huge amounts of attention because it goes to the core of the interest of the user. The person who's seen the map goes, oh, Google, oh, holy crap, look at that. They're going to get flooded. Or Dell or Cisco or Yahoo. So just a way, again, of looking for the message in the map. These are a whole series of other kinds of products, but I show them really just to illustrate the different grain of what we do. Very simple depiction of coastal protection, a land trust stewardship map in the middle, an area showing, a map showing park visitation, and then part of a brochure map on threatened areas that originally came to us in a very detailed and hard to understand form. And we worked with the group to say, well, what's your message? What's your message? And that's usually a question we try to start every client engagement with. We do use ARC tools and we do a fair amount of analysis. I think probably most of you would be familiar with all of that, and I won't try to explain any great detail about that. But we definitely are able and willing to put all of the geospatial tools that ARC can lay out to bear, depending on, of course, the quality of the underlying data and the integrity of what a client wants to do with it. This is a particular analysis of infill potential using some really very, very aggressive colors here. This is one where, working with clients get what they want. And at the end of the day, we can have an opinion about it, but we want to help them to the extent that they're willing to insist that they want it a certain way. We probably wouldn't do this quite so dramatically colored, but it makes the point that all of these areas are in the location. There's a number of things that we do that are purely illustrative. This is work on the left using ArcMap and excuse me, ArcGIS Pro and the visualization tools that are in Pro to create a 3D view of the Los Angeles basin for a group that wanted to have a much more simplified view of the water system there. And it was very effective. It was mostly for a PowerPoint presentation, so it has layers and builds. But what Arc Pro can do these days in the way of allowing a little bit better access to 3D visualization is very helpful, and we look forward to that being a better part of our toolkit over time. On the right is just a basic trails map for a land trust that wanted to have a trail map. But again, it goes to our core of trying to get rid of all the non-essential information and really just focus on what the user needs to know about and to make sure that things unfold in those layers of meaning rather than all presenting it at one time. One of the pieces of what we do is data, and the biggest thing we do in data is that we maintain the statewide database of all the parks and open space in California. This is the California Protected Areas Database, CPAD. It's an analog to the federal Protected Areas Database of the United States that the USGS publishes. We work closely with them on that process. For anybody who's interested to know this, the website for this is calands.org. And there's quite a few things you can do there to explore the data and as well as download it. The CPAD has parks for 1,000 different public agencies and nonprofits. These are not easement lands, these are owned outright in fee. And that sums to about 14,000 individual parks. We've built that database over quite a few years, and it's been very, very powerful. Not only is it useful to people generally, it's freely available, but it's also hugely useful to us because we've had so many groups who say, I know what I have, but I want to see what's around me. And there really is no other database like that in California. There wasn't until we started developing it. That's true nationally now. There really are only a handful of states, and New York is not yet one of them, that have really full databases of all the park and rec land, open space lands that are owned by public agencies and nonprofits. There's a parallel effort to the USGS data program that is run by nonprofits called the National Conservation Easement Database, and they try to gather the easement data, which is then folded into the PAD US data. But I think we're in the next couple of years very likely to see a much greater filling out of all the states that are missing data. There's things underway by the Trust for Public Land as well as other efforts to actually try to get us a national inventory that kind of looks like what California has. California's inventory is pretty much the largest one around, but it didn't start that way. When we began this work in 2008, this is what an area of Southern California was thought to contain in the way of protected lands. This is the ocean on the left. It's an area north of San Diego. But in fact, all of this land was owned in the brighter green or in the darker green was under easement. So the difference between thinking this is the protected land framework and learning that this is really the protected land framework is really, you can make bad decisions if you don't have that consolidated, integrated information available. So CPAD covers all of the state. It has, of course, very large amounts of federal land in California. It's about half of the land area of the state. And the database goes all the way down to the very smallest urban park. There are parks that are less than 1/10 of an acre in CPAD. And almost anywhere you go, visiting parkinfo.org, which is a public browser, or caliparks.org, which is another public browser of this data, or the calands.org website itself, where you can just see how to get in and learn more about what's there. there's really some wonderful possibilities for helping people use this information. And I'll refer to some of those throughout the presentation. One interesting thing about the CPAD data is that parks, quote unquote, are not necessarily parks. There are all sorts of complexity about how land ownership is tracked. So in CPAD, if we take this state park, how we really see it is as a series of 156 separate parcels. Those are individual assessor parcels that make up that very large state park. If we were to use the units framework, CPAD has a holdings feature layer basically, and a units feature layer. A unit is the aggregation of all of those holdings under current management by an agency, split by whether it's in one county or another. And then there's a super unit framework, which is now transitioning, but in general was a cartographic convention to let people have access to the whole boundary of what would be thought of as a park. There can be actually quite a bit of complication in this for anybody who deals with it, in that some areas of parks are owned by other people, managed by a park agency. Some are off limits and need to be taken out of public view. So we've learned over the years a lot about protected areas inventories, and we think we've got a pretty good system for that now. Maybe let me just sort of stop there for a second and see if anybody wants to, before I talk about the interactive work, see if anybody wants to offer any questions about the GIS side of what we do, or anything you saw in the presentation so far. Okay, let's keep going then. Feel free to jump in along the way if something occurs to you.
Okay.
About half or so of what we do falls in the GIS bucket, and about half falls in the interactive bucket. And there's a certain gray area in between those things. As most of you probably know, just GIS work itself has got clearer pathways onto the web. And of course, the tools that let us make things interactive on the web have dramatically grown in their capacity over the last few years, and the way people consume information, which means we all need to respond to it. So our basic approach here is to rely on open source software for our interactive work. We do very little with Esri's ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Server. Those are often very helpful for agencies with enterprise level needs, but in our case, working with many different groups, that model doesn't work very well. The flexibility and the tremendous capability and rapid evolution of open source software is really something that we find fits what we're trying to do a lot better. And these are for those who follow this, kind of the back-end database, the visualization side, and then the parts that help make the website functions work right. Those are all the different buzzwords of things that we use in our stack. For those who follow this and don't know about it, there's an annual conference called FOSS4G, F-O-S-S 4G, and I think it's in the US every year, maybe every other year now. If you're at all involved in this open source toolkit, finding the FOSS4G conference and trying to find a way to get there is a great adventure. You'll really learn a lot about how all this works. Otherwise, there's a lot of learning you have to do just in individual channels, figuring it out yourself. Unlike the Esri conference, which of course is a much larger framework, but is limited to the Esri stack. Sorry for any background noise here. We've got a little bit of fire engine noise there. But finally, all of this is just technical stuff. And if you don't have a good sense of how to communicate with this stuff, you just can build a lot of complicated things that people won't use very much. So again, this communication theme really drives what we try to do. This was just an early website that we did. It's Lake Winnipesaukee. They had a water quality management plan that they wanted to put on the web. And so we developed this website because they also wanted to talk about the lake. We built a little bit of interactive mapping for it as well. But it really typifies the kind of clean, basic design approach that we take to projects like this. This was all not very expensive to do. It was built on a WordPress platform, although the maps come in through an iframe using other technology. Um, but it goes to the point that a lot of times when somebody comes to you with a particular problem, I need to put my plan on a website somewhere. What they really mean is that they've got a broader communication need, and the sooner you can figure that out, the better the relationship goes. This is just another very simple thing we did where a group came to us. They had a trails challenge and in a national seashore here in California, and they simply wanted a photo uploader. They wanted to be able to have people go to their site and pop a photo on and say something and be done. So we built a very simple one. Um, the projects that we do interactively do range quite widely from very simple to incredibly complicated. This is much more on the complicated side. It's called WeedMapper. And basically it's a system for tracking what's going on with invasive species in California. There's a group in the state that follows this stuff very closely and has a lot of data. This system allows them to track on a USGS quad basis what's going on with the degree of invasiveness and the trends and what kind of eradication processes are going on. Another interesting project was a group that deals with human sexual rights, transgender issues, and other things, and they wanted a private network that allowed them to connect their members and see who in their network was related to one another. You clearly have to be behind a password login system for this, but it was very useful, still is very useful for them to have these quick network relationships show for people who are often very isolated socially and at risk. Another interesting project, these are factory farms in the upper Midwest, and this was a group that wanted to quickly be able to see what was going on with various farms and quickly determine what the scale of subsidy and pollution was in these things. They had a lot of data, and again, we built the web framework for them to play with here. Another piece that goes in the complex range, this is a group in the Portland, Oregon area. Just a second here. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry. My chat notes, I have to scroll down here. Okay. So Bill Johnson is asking this question about what inspires our design, Stamen or Nancy Duarte or anybody else? Well, curiously, Dan Rademacher, the new executive director, is from Stamen Design. I think Stamen has been a very powerful force in interactive design over the years. They've been very design forward. But I would say that a lot of our design is our own internal thinking. We've invested an awful lot in systematizing how we think about design just at the GIS level. And then we pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing. So I think if anybody comes across a great thing, whether it's an individual map or an infographic or a website, we like to sort of think about that ourselves. I've, for the last couple years, have been doing design presentations at the Esri user conference in San Diego. Alan Carroll, who runs their story map division, who was at National Geographic Maps, and I have collaborated on a full presentation on communication and design. I'll actually show a few segments of that later on. But I think, I would say, Bill, that for anybody, build your own story of great things, attention to why they work, really focus on what the user's first impression is. It's easy in building these things to stare at it for a long time, for many, many hours and go, well, okay, yeah, they need to see this now. But to forget the fact that almost every user confronts what we build in the first few seconds. And if they don't get it in the first few seconds, no matter how much care you've put for the 10th or 12th minute of their engagement, they won't get to it. So design to us is really about the quick first glance, the first few seconds when you either hook your user or you don't. And if you don't, it's a struggle to keep them focused. So yes, you need to do great detailed cartography on maps, but if the map isn't instantly intelligible to people in some compelling way, they won't get to that question. To me, that's the biggest, in 20 years of doing this and spending a lot of time doing presentations on design, that's the biggest learning overall is you have to understand how people viscerally react to things in that first glimpse, and design flows from that. There's lots of technique along the way. Um, by all means, when we get to the design session, we can talk a little more about that. So here's another kind of really complicated website. This is a group that works on trying to limit underage access to tobacco products. And there's a series of these statewide mappers. What they do is allow public health people, this is not a site for just the average person, to go in and test different policy assumptions. What would happen if we set rules that restricted retailers within 300 feet of parks or schools? What are the demographics of individual retailers? You can use a Google Street View to go browse the individual retailer if you want. You can take a look at broader census characteristics. There's just a whole bunch of different aspects of this, including getting a report for particular assumptions that you've made. This is a very finely crafted tool that's specific to public health users. It's not a mass audience kind of tool, but very, very helpful. These exist in about 6 or 8 states now, and the group involved, countertools.org, is working on getting them in more states. So they do all the curating of the thinking and the data, and we build all the web application and the back-end processing, and very, very complicated data processing goes into this in terms of what web programming can do, because it's all delivered in the browser. A very interesting use of protected areas data has been working with the state park department. For those who work with parks at all, there's a process called a SCORP, a State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan. Agencies are required to do those every 5 years, at least in the past, in order to qualify for the federal Land Water Conservation Fund money. It's unclear if that money is still going to be around now. But SCORPs are around, and so in the last year or two, the State Parks Agency here asked us to work with them on reimagining how a SCORP would get developed. And so one of the things we ended up with was this website, parksforcalifornians.org, which highlights the SCORP and particular tools. Because we had very authoritative parks data, we could build a statewide view that allowed you to pick a city or an area anywhere and see whether there were parks within half a mile of anybody, and the dark red areas on the left indicate areas that have no parks at all within half a mile, which is typically considered to be a neighborhood walking radius. And because that's not the complete picture, they also looked at park acres per thousand. So anything dark red has less than an acre of parks per thousand, because the one on the left, any size park, a little tiny park, would qualify as having that half-mile radius, whereas there's a lot of difference between a small park and a big park. So you need both views of this. But this interactive application in the website lets everybody talk about park need, and this was a driving theme in the SCORP, because what they found was statewide, basically a quarter of the state didn't have a park within half a mile, and that's a state of 40 million people. So it's a lot of people who don't have nearby parks, and that gives them a big, strong platform to work with. The other parts of the website included an agency directory so that anybody could quickly find these 1,000 agencies that own all the land, and a tool that I can quickly demonstrate online if we want to jump out to the website, that lets people test particular sites as to a whole series of demographic characteristics over here. I use this push pin, I go to an area, I click the push pin, it draws a half-mile circle. Parks wanted to have a fixed half-mile circle. It could be set to anything. and you get an instantaneous report on population, income, median income, percent in poverty, park acres per thousand, and you can test areas as to park need in a very fine-grained way. State Parks actually had us originally build this tool to manage a $300 million bond program that was to help fill out urban park needs. Applicants had to go through this and generate a report, get a grant number by showing that they qualified for the threshold conditions of that grant program. And there were limits on the number of park acres per thousand. There were limits on the number of people on per capita income and people in poverty. And if you didn't hit those metrics, you couldn't apply. So it was using the geospatial tool to qualify what ended up being hundreds and hundreds of applicants for this $300 million in park bond money. And all of that they had been doing by hand in the past. We built the tool for about $15,000 total, and that included a lot of data work to refine data for them. It was trivial compared to the costs that they were incurring of evaluating these hundreds of applications by hand, plus it gave them consistent results. So a great synergy between having good data, using simple common sense tools to help somebody solve a big problem. One of the tools that has come up in this protected land data is what we call Map Collaborator. It's a tool that we have that kind of looks like this. Basically, you use it to review data. You can go pin notes anywhere on a map or draw polygons and make comments. So this comment here in the gray box up here is a note that I submitted on our protected lands data saying, gee, this area is now open and part of a broader unit should be renamed. We invite people to comment on our protected areas data, and we assess their comments. It's not like Wikipedia where they're changing the data. They're just alerting us and saying, hey, this might be wrong. You might be missing something here. And then they have these extra tools where if I were to zoom in closely, I can use a bird's eye view or a street view to check out the details of a park. And I can add areas by drawing and saying, gee, there's a whole new park here, in addition to basic note pinning. I can also use this to search for and get reports on parks by certain kinds of agencies. It's a really flexible tool. It costs anywhere from probably $2,000 to $5,000 to deploy one of these map collaborators, but they're very, very useful. We just finished one for the County of Los Angeles. Cities going through an enormous park need process. And not only were they reviewing the park data, but they could also, for any particular agency, review the adequacy of 10 different categories of park facilities, playgrounds, ball fields, etc. So that was an extension to this. There's a simpler version of it called a viewer, where we simply pop data. And this is an interesting case where our GIS folks now know enough to characterize GIS data in CSS format for web coding, and it can simply be plopped into one of these viewers for very, very little, just a few hours of time. And it's a quick answer for people who just want to see data. Now, they could definitely use ArcGIS Online, but they wouldn't have quite the clarity and the simplicity that this gives them. And they'd have to be using ArcGIS Online. For a lot of groups, that's harder. This is another interesting site that we developed for a group that's tracking the expenditure of cap and trade funding in California. There's gazillions of dollars coming through the cap and trade funding program that's being reinvested in things that help improve climate. This system tracks the cumulative effect of those grants and then allows very detailed searching and finding out about those grants. It's a really great implementation of a pretty complicated data set. But again, it's all there to make the point that there are real benefits to this cap and trade money. Another more complicated side piece, this is a trail finder for the city and county, well, the city of Aspen and its surrounding county. They had trail GIS data in ArcGIS Online that we brought into a map that we overlaid various search functions and various other functions on. You can get elevation profiles, you can just do all sorts of things. And this is a fully mobile capable app as well. It's a hybrid download as well as a responsive website. This is the mobile app version of the program. Another interesting way of dealing with all this data, this is something for exploring conservation lands, where again, you define an area and you get a report. And that functionality is really common these days and I think very valuable. In this case, they get this well-formatted, detailed PDF report for an area that they would have selected. And it tells them in endless detail all about conservation targets and just sort of, mind-numbing stuff for average people, but very helpful for climate and biological folks. By the way, if anybody's expecting this, developing a PDF out of a web application that's nicely formatted is a really big project. It's not like just saying print to PDF. So it takes a lot of effort to make something look this good, but it's very worthwhile. So the last part I want to go through here is back to the design and communication piece. And I'll just say that it's absolutely central to what we do, that even from the first day 20 years ago that we started, we've had that on our mind. And so we've paid attention to ourselves and to others. And we think it's probably in GIS in particular, it's one of the least developed skills among GIS users, and it shouldn't be. It should be top of the mind for everybody. I mentioned before the Esri user conference. These are slides that sort of generally go through this question of how visual perception works, and this is a part of this presentation that I do at the conference, in which we talk about how the mind deals with the perception of data. And actually, this image is pretty powerful once you think about it. We're wired in evolution terms to see basic differences in contrast and shape and color in involuntary periods of time. In less than a second, your mind is already, anytime, if you look around the room that you're in, your mind, before you even have a chance of thinking about it, your mind is seeing differentiation. And your eye will go to that differentiation where it's strongest. That's how we're wired. If we spend a second or two, we go, oh, that's a column that's darker colored than the wall in back of it. I get it. Now, if I stare at it, oh, that has a scratch on it, or there's some little piece of writing on it. That's the difference between pre-attention, aha, and cognition, which is, oh, there's something there, and recognition, and then cognition, which is, okay, I want to explore it a little bit. And you really need to expose all of your map work and any visual product you're doing to that test. If somebody looks at it for just a second or two, what do they see? We have this conversation about trying it out here, where you hold a map up, somebody say, what did you see? 3 seconds later, the map goes down, you say, what did you see? And if they can't tell you that they saw the message you most wanted them to see, you haven't succeeded, because that first impression is so critical for the success of visual information. So that Esri conference goes through it. This is another slide that just tries to illustrate an app that was very, very poorly, because almost all other than these dark green blobs, everything confronts you all at once. Well, in fact, this is actually a map about stores selling tobacco that are proximate to schools, parks, and sensitive sites. Well, the parks are all you see. In fact, and we redid it, this is really a much better rendition of the stores in relation to key objects. And that's really, the way that you ought to think about these maps is you have to make the story really sell. And that's what we're good at. We also do some amount of design, publication design, and of course maps within those. This is a report on freshwater resources in California. And this is the printed version of the state SCORP, where we really encourage the State Parks Department to break the model of mini SCORPs, which are very detailed and long text, and realize that if anybody was of consequence was going to see it, decision makers, agency heads, legislators, they were going to flip through it. And if they didn't get bites by flipping through it quickly, it really wouldn't work for them. We encourage them to have a state photographer go out and take what turned out to be terrific photos of people people staring at you was very important for communication. And it was just an extension of our thinking that this is also done. We have an outside designer who helps us on things like this, but it's really our visual thinking that lays this out. So that's really kind of most of everything, and we've got a few more minutes, so I'll definitely hold off here. And I don't know, Dan, if you want to offer anything as a general comment, or if anybody wants to jump in and ask questions, this is a good time.
Yeah, I thought I'd return to this question. So as Larry mentioned, I spent the last 2.5 years at Statement Design that Bill Johnson referred to, and I think coming through that, the SCORP at the end of Larry's presentation is an interesting example where GreenInfo and hopefully the GIS community generally can create more of sort of a bridge from sort of super design forward firms like Stamen that do really fun and amazing work, but don't necessarily always connect to that sort of ground level policy work of parks planning or watershed management or policy work around tobacco sales and things like that. That happens in a more traditional GIS world. So, I mean, what's exciting about this kind of work is really bridging those two worlds, from sort of design forward thinking that maybe is a wider public, but not necessarily ground level policy, to GIS world that's really ground level policy kind of things.
One thing I'll say is that you can, there's a question here I'll come back to in a second from Antonetta, but if you go to our website, greeninfo.org, there's a section called Work, and you can basically pick and choose what you want to look at. And every one of these things are then projects which have descriptions and details. This is actually some of the detailing. It'll be a little fuzzy for you to see, but for the editing of facility condition that I mentioned for LA County, that particular project. But there's any number of interesting ways to search on different types of applications that we've done over the years. There's about 200 of them, and then there's other things you can go look at. The question from Antoinetta was, would you go back to the tobacco stores of parks near schools? And did you mean the design of the good and the bad, or the, so I assume it was this one here? Yeah, so in this, let me go back to the full screen so you can see it better. Yeah, so again, this is, extreme makeover. This is what it used to look like, and this is what we redid it to look like. We got rid of any distractions outside. We made sure, where's there is a north arrow here, unfortunately, but it's there. It's a favorite peeve of mine. But we made the legend clear. We got rid of all the labeling that really wasn't important. We could have put that in very soft grays so that as you really stared into the map, you could get it. But we made sure that the orange and the greens and the grays balanced with each other. Here, the green so dominates that you think it's a map about parks. That's your impression. You also don't have any context for the community around you, so we let some of that come in. We are fond of using some basic buffering tools for shading and feathering. We kept the same titling, but we reorganized. That we made the tobacco sales near schools. That's the title of the map. It's in sensitive sites, but it's tobacco sales, not El Cerrito stores telling tobacco by proximity. No one's going to understand that. So it's all, everything from the titling to the graphics work, it's all based on what do you want the user to experience, and how do you clear away all the junk so that they can. Maybe just if there's other questions teeing up, great, but just a couple other quick things. I mentioned the map collaborator tool, and by the way, we do a lot of work for public agencies all over the country. There's a lot of work you can do remotely these days that's quite effective. So if anybody's actually interested in projects, by all means get in touch. I'm just Larry at greeninfo.org, easy to get. But this is an example of a great tool. If you're doing data review, you fill out the stuff here, you go onto the map, you click and put your point down and you say save note, and that note is saved. If you want to kind of look in more closely, you can use these tools to browse in here a little bit just so we can see it a little bit more. But it's a great data explorer framework that really lets us see what's going on in various places. So this is an area that is in development as a park, and you can browse, the character of what it looks like. So it's really a great way to do stuff. You can also do things. Gee, show me everything that's owned by the city of Adelanto in this case. So here's a list. I can download that list into a spreadsheet. I can zoom to any particular park, and it'll take me in, and I can see that park against any number of base maps, an OpenStreetMap base map, or anything else. So these kind of tools are really very helpful for really checking this stuff out. And I should say, by the way, that there's a lot of data in a good public land inventory that isn't in Google or Bing, and it's just a way of kind of getting at this question of where there are parks and what they are. But the tool is universal; it can be used for anything. And like I said, you can go browse this anywhere off of here. So I think we'll let you wrap up unless somebody has an additional question. I see a couple more. Yes, Annette just following up. So any final questions? Feel free to get in touch. Larry at greeninfo.org. Just go to the website. We're easy to find, and there's lots of good information here.
Larry,
Go ahead.
Larry, I actually have a question for you. So a lot of the web stuff that looks like you've been doing here and stuff, you've kind of been doing the design and implementation. If there was a local government or a non-for-profit that was, say, working on their own web development but needed some help, is that something that GreenInfo?
Yeah. It's like I said, we pretty much, for whatever somebody needs, and if it's you need 10 or 20 hours of design, sketching, and thinking and review, and a little bit of guiding, that's definitely a feasible thing for us. We just bill that kind of thing hourly usually, and in general, it's going to be somewhere in the $90 to $100 an hour, or possibly a little more, just depending on the level of staff that are involved in it. But there's a lot of groups where they have a GIS staff or one person at most, and we essentially are their sidecar. We're there when they need help. We can do a screen share quickly and resolve issues for them. We can do heavier lifting for them, but it's a productive relationship, whether it's us or any other consultant you trust, to just have somebody you can go to and get some perspective and thinking. Thanks for the nice comments and the presentation. We appreciate it. And again, keep on doing good work, and think about how stuff works visually, and let that infuse your work too. So I think, Mickey, I'll turn it over to you. You can wrap up.
Okay. The only thing I'm going to mention is that, first of all, thanks for everyone who joined the presentation today, and thank you, Larry, for presenting. And also, I'd like to thank Dan for joining us too, and presenting also. And with that, when folks go to end theirs up, if you could just fill out that survey, that just helps the association track on whether we're on target with some of our webinars that we're trying to provide and meeting the needs of our membership. So please fill out that survey, and I'll leave this presentation up and running for a little bit while those surveys are being done before I close it out. And with that, once again, thanks, Larry, for presentation. It was excellent, and look forward to maybe talking to you in future here.
Great. Thanks.